Welcome to Module 14, which is dedicated to the 5 proofs for the existence of God by St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, we're not going to do all 5 proofs in one easy little module. I wish I could package them all that concisely, but I can't. They're a little complicated, and we don't need to do all 5 of the proofs here in this module because Father Barron will take us through them in the book that we are reading, Thomas Aquinas' Spiritual Master. So I'm not going to do all 5. What I'd like to do in this module is concentrate on the first proof, on the proof from motion. If you can get the first proof, then you can get the others. And the others are, I won't say variations on this same theme, but they're very much related. And in this first proof, I'll give you some of the key terms and some of the essential vocabulary that we need to understand what Thomas is talking about. And again, Father Barron will go into this in much more detail in the reading assignment. Maybe you've encountered the 5 proofs for the existence of God before. Maybe you took one of those required classes in philosophy in college. I'm going to come at these from a different direction based upon the work of Father Bob Barron. There's a really interesting, enriched view of Aquinas, I would say, that comes to us not just from Father Barron, but from other sources as well. But I think this is Father Barron's particular talent here in bringing some key spiritual insights and garnering some key spiritual insights together that are contained within these 5 proofs from Thomas Aquinas. There's real spiritual gold to be mined here, and Father Barron does really a fine job, I think, of doing that, of mining the proofs for this spiritual gold. And so we're going to be following him and looking at his take on these 5 proofs and looking at his angle that he reads these 5 proofs from. The 5 proofs of Aquinas are these. The first proof is the proof from motion, the proof from causality, the proof of necessary being, the proof of greatest being, and the proof of intelligent design. Again, we're just going to focus on the first proof, the proof from motion. Now, oceans of ink have been spilled over these 5 proofs for the existence of God from Thomas Aquinas, with supporters admiring them for their logic, for their precision, for their philosophical rigor, and for the ability to prove the existence of God apart from faith, but just to rationally demonstrate it. His supporters see Thomas as pulling this off quite well, with his detractors just throwing up their hands saying these are hopelessly medieval, they are abstract, they're cold, they're non-biblical. You get the idea. They tend to be divided into one camp or the other pretty much. These proofs are easily among the most famous ideas in theology, shall we say, with both supporters and detractors lining up in reaction to them. And it can cross denominational lines. There have been some believers who don't think much of these proofs. And there have been some unbelievers, some non-Catholics, some non-Christians that admire them greatly. There have been very famous Catholic theologians like Karl Rahner who, he was leery of this approach by Aquinas. He thought it was again, too philosophical, non-biblical. He had some other objections to them, but the great Karl Rahner didn't think much of these proofs, whereas a Protestant, Keith Ward at Oxford, admires them greatly. And so it crosses denominational lines, people who are really impressed with these proofs from Aquinas with some other folks who are not, to put it mildly. I side with those who admire them, or else I wouldn't be devoting a module to them. And in fact, there's a really interesting Thomistic revival that it's catching its second wind, shall we say. It started under Pope Leo XIII in 1879 with his encyclical Aeterni Patris. This inaugurated sort of a return to Thomas Aquinas. It advocated returning to Aquinas and mandated that Aquinas be taught in the seminaries back then. So this Thomistic revival starts in 1879 through the efforts of Pope Leo XIII, but it continued throughout the 20th century with philosophers like Joseph Pieper and Etienne Gilson, professional philosophers, Thomistic philosophers, of course, but also laymen like G.K. Chesterton, who was not a professional philosopher. He was a journalist of all things, but many people to this day think that Chesterton's book on Aquinas remains the best one. Some people will quibble with some of the historical detail or some of the facts that Chesterton relies upon, but Chesterton has a way of getting at the heart of Aquinas. Well, even professional philosophers like Gilson say that that Chesterton wrote the best book on Aquinas. He continues in our day through the efforts of Father Bob Barron and this interesting book that he has written and that we will be reading. There was a wonderful Dominican at Oxford who recently deceased, Herbert McCabe, just a delightful and challenging Thomistic commentator, as well as Dennis Turner. I've introduced him to you in the previous module. He's now teaching at Yale. He used to be at Cambridge and was great friends with McCabe, but Yale has so much money that it lured Dennis Turner away from Cambridge University up to New Haven, Connecticut. All of this is very encouraging to me. This Thomistic revival that is really gaining speed. It stalled out after Vatican II. Now, not because of Vatican II, certainly not because of the council, but still after the council, Thomas kind of fell out of favor. Theologians weren't turning to him. They were turning to other sources and to other theologians, and I think that impoverished the theology written in the 70s and the 80s. But this Thomistic revival that Leo XIII inaugurated, there was this pause after Vatican II, but it's gaining speed again. And there are some really impressive young theologians who are doing some excellent work in Thomistic studies. And the more the church's theologians turn to Thomas, the better off the church will be, and the richer theology will be as well. It's not just theologians and philosophers who are so impressed with St. Thomas. There was also Flannery O'Connor. I hope you know who Flannery O'Connor is. If not, run to Eighth Day Bookstore and get Flannery O'Connor's short stories. The great Catholic Southern novelist Flannery O'Connor used to read Aquinas for 15 minutes every night before going to bed. And she has this really delightful anecdote that she shares in her memoirs. This is what she says about St. Thomas. I couldn't make any judgment on the Summa except to say this: I read it every night before I go to bed. If my mother were to come in during the process and say, turn off that light, it's late, I, with lifted finger and broad, bland, beatific expression, she thinks Thomas was like that, would reply, on the contrary. I answer that the light, being eternal and limitless, cannot be turned off. Shut your eyes, or some such thing. In any case, I feel I can personally guarantee that St. Thomas loved God, because for the life of me, I cannot help loving St. Thomas. Okay, with all of this as the prelude, let's now turn to these 5 proofs, at least the first one in particular, to see the spiritual richness that is contained therein. Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master, that's the title of the book by Father Barron that we're reading, but most people don't think of Aquinas like that. Even the title of this book is instructive. Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master? Most people think of Aquinas as a brilliant theologian, a fantastic philosopher, a keen logician, but spiritual master? He seems too cold, too abstract, too philosophical to be a spiritual master for our times. And yet Barron, of course, thinks differently, or else he would have titled the book something else. No, Barron is convinced that Thomas Aquinas was a spiritual master, and there are rich, profound spiritual truths that can be gleaned from the writings of this admittedly medieval thinker. Okay, let's dive in. How are we to approach these 5 proofs from Thomas Aquinas? Well, Barron starts us in the right direction right at the start by saying, don't think of these proofs as something like scientific proof. I mean, Thomas was pre-scientific. Don't think of them as scientific proofs like we normally think of the term. Remember, science just can only measure the observable world. And while Thomas will start with the observable world, he obviously doesn't end there with his considerations on God. So they can't be strictly scientific proofs like we think of science, because science is restricted to measuring and observing the physical world. So they're not scientific, neither are they mathematical, in the sense that mathematical proof can just end all discussion. I mean, 1 + 1 = 2, there's not a whole lot of disagreement. Once you get to how 1 + 1 proves 2, that tends to end the discussion. So they're not scientific, they're not mathematical like that. Instead, Barron says, see them as 5 ways to God, 5 different ways to God, not offering scientific or mathematical proof that will just end all discussion, because they certainly don't do that. Many atheists have read these proofs and they have their reasons for objecting to them. Not all of them are fair or even correct in my opinion, but anyway, back to my main point. See them not as offering proofs that end all debate and discussion. Barron says, see them as 5 different ways leading to God. Because Barron says that's really what Aquinas was intending. According to Barron, Aquinas wasn't writing for atheists. There weren't just that many around back then. Remember, Aquinas is writing for seminarians primarily. I mean, that's the audience. That's his intended audience in the Summa Theologia. It's to seminarians, to believers, obviously. He's not trying to convince the hardened atheists into believing in God. Instead, Aquinas believes in God, and the audience that he's writing for believes in God. And so see them not as offering that kind of proof, but as 5 different ways leading to God. Now, I do think the proofs do a little bit more than that, than what Father Barron says. I mean, Aquinas definitely thought that he was offering a rational proof for the existence of God. So I'm not disagreeing with Father Barron so much as trying to highlight that there are people who might take issue with Barron on this point, that Aquinas was doing maybe a little bit more than that Aquinas was still, in his mind, thinking that these offered a rational demonstration for the existence of God. I don't want to quibble here, especially with Father Barron, but they definitely, in my opinion, prove that it's not irrational to believe in God. And let me tell you, the new atheists love to level that accusation against us. They love to say how irrational it is to believe in God. And I think that proofs, if an open mind reads them and a fair heart judges them, will say that, well, it's not entirely irrational what these Christians are doing, and maybe that's an important gain here at the beginning of our conversations with the new atheists. We'll see them in more detail later, in a later module. Okay, Aquinas, writing for believers, let's now, you and I, fellow believers, look at the first proof from motion in a little bit more detail. Now, fair warning. We're going to have to look at some medieval categories. We're going to have to understand some of the language that Thomas uses. There's no way around this. Now, hang in there with some of this medieval philosophy, and I won't belabor the point, but let's face it, we just can't dispense with some of the key categories that Thomas uses to build his proof. And the two main points are going to be potency and act. We're going to have to come to grips and have a little bit of an understanding of what Aquinas means by potency and act. Okay, let me just put the first proof from motion on your screen. I think it's important for you to see this and for you to read through this. Now, do not take fright if upon seeing this language you throw up your hands and want to run out into the kitchen and get a Coke or something stronger. Just read the proof, read the language here that constitutes the first proof. I don't need to read it for you. You can do that for yourself. Or if you want to pause me now to read it, if my talking is getting in the way of your understanding, go ahead and pause me now. But I'm going to keep talking if you don't pause me and start to unpack the first proof from motion. Okay, what does this mean? All this talk of potency and act. Let's define these two key essential Thomistic terms, potency and act. Potency basically is whatever is in the process of moving, whatever is changing, whatever is becoming, can be said to be in the state of actualizing its potency. Potency is the potential to change, the potential to become, the potential to move, and if it's actually moving, if it's in motion, it's been set in motion by something Thomas calls act. Okay, a little bit more on these two key Thomistic terms. I'm not going to go into all of the details that Thomas uses with respect to these two key terms, but we have to grasp this distinction. Here's an example to illustrate the distinction between potency and act. Let's say that you're taking piano lessons, and your piano teacher says you have the potential to become a great piano player. Well, that means that teacher's seen something in you, you've started, you're in the process, you're on the way, you have begun making those changes, you have the potential, which is something in and of itself, you have something, you have that potential, but you're still not there yet. That final change into the great piano player has not yet occurred. You've begun. So you have something. You have the potential, someone says, to get there, to actually becoming a great piano player, but it also means that you're not quite there yet. The final change into the great piano player has not yet happened. But if you do finally make it into that final form of a great piano player, when you finally have arrived there, there's no more potential in you if you're actually there. A final change has occurred. You are now a great piano player. You've actually become one. You are one. So you're no longer a potentially great piano player. Instead, you actually are a great piano player. You've actualized your potential. So much so that you have no more potential left. All that potential to become great has finally changed into actually being great. So there's no more potency left in you if you actually are great. All that potential has been actualized and finally changed from potential greatness into actual greatness. See the difference? Potency is this process of change, this process of movement, the process of becoming. You have to have it to start with in order to change into something else. But for Aquinas, act, at least this final category of great piano player, that occurs, or that's what makes the change into the final state possible. To finally become a great piano player, There has to have been some act that changed you from potentially great into actually great. Okay, that's a contemporary example. Let's look at one that Thomas himself preferred, and just to reinforce some of these concepts. Let's look at Thomas Aquinas' famous example of the burning log. The log has the potential to become ash. The log always has the potential to become hot. Now, ice does not have the potential to become ash. It does not have the potency to become ash. Ice will never become ash because it doesn't have the potency to burn, which is what is needed for ash. Now, ice may have the potency to become a puddle of water. It has a different kind of potency, but again, that's different from the potency that exists in the log. The log always has the potential to burn, which ice does not. Instead, log has the potential to become ash. Okay, but even with this different potency in ash, different from ice, the potency in the log will not actually happen without something making it happen. Ash will not automatically, let me say that again. The log will not automatically turn into ash by itself. It needs something else to actualize this potency. It needs fire. Fire is the act that changes and actualizes the potency to burn, the potential to burn, into actually burning. Fire is the act that actualizes the potency in the log and turns the log into ash. The log cannot catch fire by itself. It always has the potential to burn, but it cannot actually burn without the act of fire. Fire is the act that changes the potential for ash into actual ash. Okay, that's potency and act. Two key essential terms for understanding anything that Thomas wants to say. Now, I'm not going to get bogged down with this, and we're not going to really investigate those differences any further. The main point that Thomas makes here is that nothing can move itself. Potency cannot actualize itself. The log cannot just automatically turn into ash. It has the potential to become ash, but it cannot do it on its own. The log always has this potency to become ash, but it cannot become ash all by itself, automatically, on its own. The log requires something else. It requires the act of fire to move it from potential ash into actual ash. The log cannot activate its potency all on its own. It requires something else. It requires the act of fire to actualize its potency, to move it from potential ash into actual ash. Okay, I'm sure I belabored that point, but I'm trying to get to a more significant point for our purposes here, that nothing can move itself. Thomas says nothing can change itself. It's only changed, it's only moved by another, by something else. Now, Aquinas, through the lens of Bob Barron, will develop this key insight like this. Nothing can move itself. Now, this might be a trivial example to talk of logs turning into ash, but we're going to arrive at a profound spiritual truth, that nothing can move itself. Whatever is moved by another. And so to return to the log example, what is it that takes the log and changes it into ash? We all know by now it's fire. Well, what brought the fire? What caused the fire? Lightning. Well, what brought the lightning? The clouds. What causes the clouds? Humidity. I mean, you can see I can keep this up for quite some time, but we cannot keep it up forever, is where Thomas is leading us. Not forever, not for infinity. At some point, it has to end, this backward change of events. It has to stop somewhere. All of this movement by another, by something else, which is in turn moved by something previously, all this tracing backwards just cannot logically go on forever. At some point, there has to be a something or a someone who puts things into motion, who starts it all off. Something cannot come from nothing. So whatever it was that was the first thing that started all of this moving, well, Scientists might call it the Big Bang. But even the Big Bang did not start up all by itself. There is no cogent explanation for that. Science, again, is becoming quite astute at telling us what happened within those first milliseconds of creation, then those first milliseconds right after the Big Bang. And I love all of those astrophysical speculations and discussions. That's great for science to tell us what happened within those first milliseconds right after the Big Bang, but science will never, ever be able to answer why the Big Bang. It can tell us a lot about the Big Bang. It answers questions involving what happened right after the Big Bang. It can answer a lot about what concerning the Big Bang, but science can never tell us why the Big Bang. It can never answer the question why. Science will never be able to explain what was going on before anything existed. I mean, remember, science is restricted to the observable world. Science can tell us an awful lot about the physical, measurable, observable world that we live in. But it cannot tell us anything about what happened before there was an observable world to begin with. Science cannot tell us anything about anything before there's anything to observe. Okay, so the answer to why the Big Bang or why the world, well, it's not an answer science is going to ever come up with. The only answer to why is God, a creator, which is outside the realm of science, and that bothers science, or at least scientists, some scientists, because they want to be able to explain everything. But science is great within certain parameters, but it can't go beyond those parameters without ending up making ridiculous sounding statements. Okay, what is then the first mover that set all these things into motion? Well, Aquinas is going to conclude the first proof with God. I mean, that's God for Aquinas. In his first proof from motion, God is the first mover. God was the one who set everything into motion. There had to have been a first mover, an unmoved mover in his language. Remember, everything else in life that we can observe is moved by something else or can be moved by something else. But all of that backward progression has to end up somewhere at an unmoved mover, a first mover, which Aquinas calls God. That, in a nutshell, is the proof from motion. Now, you may be saying to yourself, oh, okay, so far, so boring. I mean, maybe all the detractors were right. Maybe Aquinas is hopelessly medieval. Maybe this is all of this potency and act and first mover talk. Maybe it's just so dull, so sterile, so non-biblical. Maybe all the detractors were right. All of this talk about this cold first mover. Now we're going to be able to see the talent of Father Barron, I put to you, and we can see his talent in what comes next. Barron's going to say, don't misunderstand Aquinas on this point. Aquinas, according to Barron, is not really overly concerned with the origins of the universe. Aquinas is not trying to come up with his medieval version of the Big Bang Theory. Aquinas is not doing science, he's not doing astrophysics, and really Aquinas isn't all that overly concerned, even with the first mover. Yes, that's how the first proof culminates, in the existence of the first mover, but the identity of the first mover is not of determinate importance for Aquinas. Yes, the proof ends there, but that's not where Aquinas really wants to put our focus. Remember, Aquinas believes in Jesus, he believes in the Trinity. All this talk of the first mover, that's not the whole story, not even for Thomas Aquinas. And remember, if we just limit God to being a first mover, what's that? Well, that's deism that we saw in the previous module. Deism has this first mover God who sets everything into motion and is thus no longer concerned with his creation. One of the two extremes to avoid, as we learned in the last module. So the first mover and the identity of the first mover, even Aquinas is going to say that's not going to be enough. It's sufficient to offer one rational way into God, but it's not the whole picture when it comes to God. And here's Father Barron's keen insight. In this first proof from motion, Yes, the proof culminates in the first mover, but again, Barron says Aquinas is not content to just remain with God as the first mover, period. Instead, he says the proof is really concerned with the motion and the power to move us here and now today. Yes, the first proof from motion culminates with the first mover, yet remember the key thing there was that nothing can move itself. And so yes, we do trace the chain all the way back to the first mover, but Barron says don't stop there. Instead, fast forward to now. Barron says Aquinas is not concerned with the origins of the universe so much as he is concerned with the power that moves us here and now. And what is that power that can change us here and now? What is that power that moves us today? Oh, that Aquinas is very interested in. So Aquinas sees God not just as the first mover, but he sees that all movement in our life is supported by him, by God. Let's look at the movement of the human person, Aquinas urges. The movements of our hearts and minds and soul. What moves these? What do we allow to move these? You see, Aquinas is not really all that interested in inanimate objects like logs and lightning bolts and fire. Those are just illustrations. What Aquinas is interested in is in deepening your faith and leading you closer to a clearer understanding of God. And also how that God moves in your life. What moves us closer to God. According to Aquinas, all movement, all motion in our lives is not just directed by our human wills. Remember, all motion is moved by something else. It's connected to something else, and that's ultimately going to be God for Aquinas, the one who makes all motion possible. According to Aquinas, you cannot so much as click the mouse on your computer without being in some relation to God. You can't even make a move like that without being in some relationship to God, who is the first mover, the author of all motion in creation. Now, this is going to suggest that creation is not just something that happened 8 billion years ago or whatever, but that creation is something that is sustained and kept in motion by God, the first mover. We're going to explore that doctrine of creation in the very next module. So I'm going to leave some of those details about creation for that one. Instead, let's just focus on this idea of motion from Aquinas, and that nothing moves itself. Now, of course, we think otherwise, don't we? We think that we are the ones in charge. We think that we are the ones making everything happen in life. We think that everything boils down to us and to what we can do and to what we have to make happen. And so we're so harried and worn out and exhausted because we think it's all up to us. And a little more unappealingly, we think we are the ones making everything happen, that we are the top dog, that we are number one. It's enough to look at this one saying from Thomas Aquinas that no one, nothing moves itself to have all of those false illusions blown away. Now, why do we think this? Why do we think that we are the masters of our fate? Why do we think that we are in control and in charge, that we have to move everything and we make everything happen? Could it be yet another instance of the pusilla anima that we have been introduced to? It's the pusilla anima, the small soul that thinks it is in charge, that it has to be in charge. It's the pusilla anima that feeds this illusion that we are in control, or that we can be in control, that it is in charge. It's enough for this one dictum from Thomas Aquinas to blow all that away. No one ultimately moves himself or can move himself. Nothing can move itself, but it has to be moved by another. We do not move ourselves. God moves us or allows us to move. We do not move God. So we are not the ones in charge and in control. God is. No matter what the pusilla anima may think, there's only one unmoved mover, and it's God, obviously not us. So Aquinas, according to Barron, is trying to blow away all of these false illusions of the human ego. If we move, we are in some relation to God, the first mover, the author of all motion in the universe. Now, this does not mean that all movement, all motion is the same. We can certainly give ourselves over to the wrong things. We can move in the wrong direction in our lives. We can let ourselves be moved by sin, by wrongdoing. We can give ourselves to all of that kind of false motion. We can give our lives to prestige, to workaholism, to all sorts of things that never satisfy us. If we give our lives to anything but God, Aquinas says, watch out. What you're doing is you're giving your life, you're handing your life over to a finite thing, to a moved mover, to a contingent reality. Only one is the unmoved mover. Only one is infinite. Only one is non-contingent. That's God. So why do we give ourselves over to work, to fun and money and prestige and all these things? Why do these things fail to ultimately satisfy us? Well, now we know. Aquinas helps us see it. We're giving our lives over to finite realities, to moved movers, to contingent things. And because they are finite, of course they fail to satisfy us. Of course, finite things can never ultimately be the foundation of our lives because they're finite. There's only one infinite. There's only one unmoved mover. There's only one that can truly satisfy us, and that's God. And now we know why. Whenever we give ourselves over to anything finite, even if it's good, but even if it's good, it's not going to ultimately do it for us. And of course, sinful things definitely won't. Only God is the unmoved mover. Only God can truly satisfy. All else will pale in comparison to him. All moved movers fall woefully short. Again, these moved movers, these are what Thomas called contingent beings. Contingent beings, they can be good and they can be bad for us, but if they exist, if they're created good, what contingency means is just that they're finite. They're not eternal. They live and they die. They come in and out of existence. They can be good while they last, but they don't last forever because they're contingent. And since they are contingent, since they come and go, they cannot be the sure foundation of our lives. They cannot give us that true peace that the human heart so desperately wants. Only something permanent, truly permanent, non-contingent, infinite, eternal could do that. Only God. God is the only non-contingent that there is. Only God, therefore, truly satisfied. Father Barron puts it like this. Here's a short video clip from Father Barron that I think captures much of what I've been trying to say so far.
Well, it appears as though another prominent British intellectual has weighed in on the question of God, this time Stephen Hawking, who's probably the best known scientist in the world. In a book that's due to come out the very week the Pope arrives in England, he's announced that the universe requires no creator. It just struck me as interesting. I suppose there's no intelligent design behind that little arrangement of publication date, the book on atheism as the Pope arrives, but that's commentary maybe for another day. I must confess, something in me always tightens when a scientist pontificates about matters properly philosophical or religious. See, there's a qualitative difference between science and philosophy. Science seeks after events and objects and phenomena within the empirically observable and measurable universe. That's the proper purview of science. Philosophy and religion seek after ultimate and final causes. Science as such simply cannot adjudicate questions that lie outside of its proper purview, which is precisely why scientists end up saying a lot of silly things when they talk about philosophy and religion. I'll give you now a good example. I was reading a lot of the articles that have appeared about this book, and they give some excerpts. Here's one of them from Hawking himself. Because there's a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Well, first of all, here's the confusion in my mind. Which is it, Dr. Hawking? Is it gravity or is it nothing? There's quite a difference between the two. If you mean, as many have said, the universe just spontaneously creates itself out of nothing, I can only throw up my hands. To look at the universe in all of its wild and radical complexity and all of its stunning mathematical complexity, to say simply all of that came spontaneously from nothing strikes me as ludicrous. There's a adage from the classical philosophical tradition which is actually hard to improve upon. It says, ex nihilo nihil fit. From nothing comes nothing. If a teacher heard this from a student who was trying to explain some phenomenon within nature, oh, it just happened. It just spontaneously popped into being. I'd be willing to bet that professor would be pretty unhappy with that answer. Yet, when it comes to the most compelling and the most fascinating question of all, why is there something rather than nothing, we're expected to find that answer rationally satisfying. Now, I can only smile because I come up against this a lot in my dialogues with atheists. When you really push the question, you really press the question of where's the universe come from, almost inevitably you'll come to this point where they say, well, it just happened. Something, meaning the whole of the universe, just came from nothing. Of course, the reason I smile is I'm supposed to be the avatar of medieval superstition. I'm supposed to be the one defending old pre-scientific views of the world, and yet it seems to take a greater leap of faith to say there's a God than to say something came from nothing. The latter proposition strikes me as far more unreasonable than the first. Okay, let's say Hawking means the other side of it, if I go back to his, I think, rather incoherent statement. Let's say gravity is the ultimate cause of the universe. Some force within nature is identified as the ultimate cause of all things, of the being of the universe. Now, this does have a long philosophical pedigree, going back to the pre-Socratic philosophers who were trying to find the building block of reality. And they would say things like it was earth, or it was water, it was fire, it was prime matter that gave rise to all things. But see, as philosophy moved forward, and as the influence of the religions was felt, the question became more refined. Because this question about the universe, why is there something rather than nothing, is not a quest for something within the universe. Not a quest after one particular cause. It's asking after the very being of the universe. Why is there something and rather not nothing, is the way Heidegger put it. Now, here we have to look along this line. What explains the contingency of the world? Technical philosophical way of saying the fact that the world and things in the world do not explain themselves. So you and I are contingent. Why? We had parents, we eat and drink, we breathe. All signs that we don't contain within ourselves the reason for our own existence. We're non-self-explanatory. Okay, so we have to look for extrinsic causes. Let's say they're contingent. They too depend on forces outside themselves. We haven't found our answer yet. So we appeal further and further and further. What you can't do is appeal infinitely or indefinitely to other contingent things, because then you have not found what you're looking for, which is to explain our own existence or the existence of the universe today. What you have to come to, Catholic philosophy says, is some reality which is non-contingent, which does carry within itself the very reason for its own existence. That whose very nature is to be. And this is precisely what Catholic philosophy identifies as God. God is the non-contingent ground of contingency. Now, one more step. That whose very nature is to be cannot be limited or imperfect in its being, because its very nature is to be, to exist. It must therefore be the fullness of existence, nothing but existence. And now again you see why we identify it with God. It must be that which is properly unlimited in its being. What it can't be is some finite and finally contingent force within the universe. Gravity is indeed an impressive law, an impressive force, an impressive power. But gravity is finite. Gravity is variable. Gravity in itself is not that which exists through the power of its own essence. And it's ludicrous to suggest that anything like it within the universe is itself the cause of the being of the universe. There's a line I came across in one of the articles about Hawking's book, and it was illuminating, maybe despite itself. Here's what the author said. In his new book, The Grand Design, Hawking sets out a comprehensive thesis that the scientific framework leaves no room for a deity. And I'm sure he meant that to imply that science proves there's no God. But see, I would say that's quite right. The scientific framework means that epistemological purview that takes in the world of our experience, the world that we can measure, that we can observe. It is indeed right to say, within that framework, I'm not going to find a deity. Why? Because God is not a being. God is not one reality among many. God is not a force within the observable, measurable cosmos. So it's quite right to say science qua science is not going to find God. Think of that famous cosmonaut who went up into outer space back in the late 50s. I'm up here in the heavens, he said, and there's no God. Well, come on. No one thinks God is a being you're going to find or a force you're going to find within the universe. The problem here is something I pointed to before, which is scientism. The tendency to reduce all legitimate knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. If science can't get it, it's not real. Now that's scientism, that's problematic. You see it very clearly on display in the so-called new atheists. Look at Christopher Hitchens, look at Daniel Dennett, look at Sam Harris. You'll find over and over again the reduction of knowledge to scientific knowledge. What I found actually kind of disappointing and disconcerting is that Stephen Hawking, maybe the greatest scientist in the world, has succumbed precisely to this problem.
Okay, again, we will take the new atheists in Module 17 in more detail, so we'll learn about those guys in more detail and what they're up to. And Father Barron mentioned them in that video clip. We'll explore them in more detail later, so I'll leave them for a later module. But the main point that Barron is making is there's only one sure foundation. There's only one unmoved mover. There's only one infinite, one eternal, one non-finite, and that is God. So that is why God is the only truly satisfier of the human heart. Now we can give our lives to many things, to good things and to bad things. We can even give them to good causes, to good efforts, to helping out around the parish. All good things, of course. But even good things are never going to do it for us ultimately. Even good things, they're all finite things. They're all movers in Aquinas' language. So even good things are not going to be the ultimate foundation of our lives or the ultimate basis for security and the ultimate means for finding the peace that the human heart yearns for. That can only be found in one place, only in God, because He is the only unmoved mover, the only infinite, the only non-contingent, the only eternal. But knowing about these unmoved movers, it helps explain why a lot of people can't get no satisfaction, to quote Mick Jagger, in their lives today. Even when they're turning to seemingly good things, they're still finite things. And there's only one that is infinite, God. Oh, so what do you think about Thomas Aquinas now as a spiritual director? Unmoved movers and all that talk, it might sound cold at first, but when you can see what Thomas is really leading us to understand, I think it's very spiritually rich. Okay, handing one's life over to moved movers and to finite things, well, there was one guy who knew all about that, the great St. Augustine, especially as a young man. Augustine handed his life over to all sorts of contingent, finite realities, to sex, money, philosophy, prestige, politics, to moved movers of every sort, to all sorts of finite things. Moved movers, he tried about all of them, but they never brought him the peace that he was so looking for, and now we know why. Augustine found real peace and real satisfaction, real rest and fulfillment in only one source, in God, the only unmoved mover there is, to use the language of Aquinas. Augustine learned the hard way, the lesson that Aquinas is trying to teach through his first way, his first proof of motion, that the heart is restless until it rests in thee, O God. And Augustine would know, because again, as a young man, he tried just about everything he could other than turning directly to God, but he got there. In the end, he found that beauty, ever ancient, ever new, that once he turned to explicitly, finally, that restless young man found that rest and that peace and security that he'd been searching for in all the wrong places for far too long. He learned that happiness is not to be found in itself, certainly not in the human ego and not in any other created reality, all moved movers. And so of course they're going to fail to satisfy. Now Aquinas' first proof from motion teaches that nothing in life ever truly satisfies outside of God. No other moved mover, as fascinating and as enticing and as interesting as it may be, will ever satisfy us for very long. No moved mover can satisfy the human heart that's made to be in relation to God. According to Barron, this is why Aquinas wrote his first proof in the first place. Not so much to prove the existence of God. Again, he already knew that. His readers already believed it. But rather, according to Barron, Aquinas wrote his first way to point out the one sure place where the soul can find happiness and where happiness truly results, by resting in the only unmoved mover, in God. Understanding the spirituality packaged in the first way, in this argument from motion, we're going to arrive at the conclusion that whatever is in motion is moved by God, and that there is no motion in life that is not thereby in some way connected to God, under the influence of God. And if at any time we are moving towards something, towards anything, just the mere fact that we are moving means that we have to be in some relation to the author of all motion, to God. Desiring something, anything, even non-religious things. Just the fact that we are desiring something, that we are moving towards something, that we want something else. Even though we can often be mistaken about where to look, again, Augustine sure was for a long time. But just the fact that we are desiring something else, that means we're moving, wanting something else. Just the fact that we have this kind of movement in our soul towards something else, anything else. Just the fact that there is that motion, that means that we're in some way oriented toward God. Just the fact that we move towards something means that there's some openness to God, the author of all motion. Now sometimes people will obviously choose the wrong things in life. I mean, they'll choose sinful things, they'll choose very destructive things, really sadly. And sometimes they will spend a long time going the wrong way and going in the wrong direction. But notice, even if they're going in the wrong direction, the fact that they're moving doesn't mean that means they're not entirely cut off from God. Let me put it that way. Now, I'm not condoning the sinful activity, obviously, but I want us to look a little more profoundly at human life and existence, and this idea that even if we're moving in the wrong direction, the fact that we're desiring something, even that can highlight the existence of God and point to it in some ill-defined way. Now, sometimes people who are going in the wrong direction, they feel entirely cut off from God, and they think there's no hope for them, and they think they're lost or they're cut off. But Aquinas will say from his proof from motion that even if somebody's going the wrong direction and moving in the wrong direction, the fact that they're in motion means that they're still in some way in connection to God. God is not easy to get away from, I should say. In fact, I'm going to say, according to Aquinas, it's impossible. As long as we're in this life, before death, I'm going to qualify it that way. But Aquinas is going to say that we cannot ever in this life get entirely away from God, just because God is the one who sets everything in motion. But once a person realizes that even in the wrong choices made in life, that even those can somehow steer us back to God, and even those have in some inchoate way some connection to God, just realizing that can help a person turn back explicitly to God and go back in a much healthier direction, go back in a positive, godly direction. Sometimes just realizing that even the false moves in life, even those can somehow steer us back towards God, can be just a very graced insight. Thomas Aquinas says this: all people in desiring happiness are really desiring God, whether they know it or not explicitly. Now again, to be sure, we can all live under the illusion that something else other than God's going to make us happy. And we can make all kinds of false choices, all kinds of sinful actions. We can spend a long time going down dead ends in life. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. And that there aren't real tragic consequences for a person who chooses to live like that. Human beings are quite capable of living with falsehood. But Aquinas is going to say the fact that even by desiring anything, just the fact that we desire something else means that we're in some ways connected to God. And therefore, no move in this life, at least, there is no move that is not in some way connected to the first mover. Again, how about that for spirituality? That no move, not even sinful moves in this life, will mean that we're ever entirely cut off from God. Thomas Merton, contemporary Augustine, if ever there was one, noticed this when he started writing his autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain. Still a wonderful book. Still just as germane as ever. In that, well, again, as a modern-day Augustine, he's writing his modern-day confessions here in The Seven-Story Mountain. Merton notes that when looking back over his life, he could see more clearly what was going on in some of the false moves and some of the sinful actions he made as a young man. Looking back, he could see several false moves, several dead ends. But looking back over his life, he could also see this, that even in those false moves, even those represented a searching for God, a desire for God. It was groping, it was stammering, it was obviously misdirected, but still, even in the misdirected moves in his life, even that was him desperately trying to reach God. Looking back, he could see that God was present even in those times. And even the seemingly least God-filled time in his life, if even in those times, looking back, he could see that God was still with him, and that even some of those false moves, eventually, through much pain and toil and suffering, even some of those false moves, through the grace of God, ultimately led him into the Catholic Church and closer to God. That God can work in even the hardest human heart, of course God can, because God is the one who sets everything into motion. Okay, this concludes the argument from motion. Again, there are 4 others. I'm not going to take you there. Instead, I'd like for you to just look at this short video clip from Father Barron that will highlight these other proofs from Aquinas, and we're going to let this other video try to tie down some of the details and the other proofs for the existence for God.
That's the great question. How do we know there's a God? Why do we believe in God at all? That's the foundation for the whole spiritual life. And the great theologians and spiritual teachers have used different approaches to this question over the centuries. One of my favorites is the approach that begins with desire. We human beings desire the truth. Our minds seek the truth. And we get it sometimes. But no matter how much truth we get out of this world, it's never enough. The mind remains unsatisfied. Our wills seek the good, And they find it in a lot of ways in this world. But no matter how many goods we attain, we're never really satisfied. We seek justice in all kinds of ways, and we achieve it, sometimes to a remarkable degree. Think of in our own time, the civil rights movement, the end to apartheid, the breakdown of the Soviet Union. All those were wonderful things that were attainments of justice. But no matter how much justice we attain, we never have enough. There's something in us, this desire for the good, the true, the just, that pushes us beyond this world. This approach is called the argument from desire. You can't desire what you don't know. Therefore, if we're desiring something that transcends anything in this world, in some way we must already know it. Therefore, we do know the truth itself. We do know the good itself. We do know justice itself. And that's who God is. God is not one of the true things in the world, but God is the truth itself, which has seized the mind of any scientist, any philosopher, any seeker after the truth. God is not one more good thing in the world, but God is goodness itself, which has seized anybody when he's living the moral life or seeking the ethically good. God is not one more just thing in the world, but God is justice itself, which has seized the will of the lawyer or the judge or anyone seeking justice. The Bible talks about the primacy of God. When you're seeking God, the most important thing to realize is you've already been found by God. Remember the Russian cosmonauts went up into space and they kind of sarcastically radioed back to Earth, well, we're up in the heavens and we haven't found God. Well, of course, any biblical person would know you'll never find God that way. Of course not. You don't find God anywhere in the cosmos he's made. But God is the creative source of all that exists in the cosmos. So that's one approach to God, beginning with our own deep desire. Here's a second approach, and it comes from our present Pope, who wrote a great book in 1968 called Introduction to Christianity. In that book, he formulates this argument. And what I like about it is it shows the link between religion and science. Because very often those two are seen as enemies. He says, no, at their depth, religion and science come together. Here's why. What does every scientist assume? Whether you're a physicist, a chemist, a biologist, a psychologist, whatever you are, you assume that being is intelligible. That means that the world can be known. Look, even the name psychology, designates logos, word. The scientist goes out to meet a world that's imbued with meaning. Well, how do you explain that? How do you explain the universality of the meaningfulness of the world? Ratzinger said, it's because it's been thought into being. In other words, the world is not just dumbly there. Rather, the world is filled with logos. It's filled with reason, with mind, which is why when we understand a truth, we say we recognize it. He says, right, you recognize it. You think it again, because it's already been thought into being by God. So he argues from the objective intelligibility of the world to the existence of a great intelligence, which has thought the world into being. Here's a third approach the philosophers and theologians have used. It's called the argument from contingency. It's a fancy way of saying that the world as we know it exists, but doesn't have to exist. You and I are here, but we don't have to be here. There's nothing necessary about our being. And it's true, the world as we know it is fleeting, it's passing. Therefore, we have to go outside the world to God. God who does exist through himself and who therefore grounds and creates the whole of the world that we know. Relatedly, Dorothy Day, when she was in the process of coming to the church, she was going through a process of conversion. She had a child. And one day when she was on the porch of her house and she was holding her child, she said, I felt a gratitude that was so enormous that I knew it would correspond to nothing in this world. There was nothing, nobody in this world she could possibly thank that would correspond to the gratitude she was feeling. That's it. That's exactly it. What she was sensing was, God, this world, myself, my child, none of it has to be here, yet it's here. And the proper response is, thank you to the person who made them.
Okay, so much for your introduction to the proofs for the existence of God from Thomas Aquinas as read by Father Bob Barron. There will be much more from Father Barron in the reading assignment, so I will leave those additional details to him. Thank you very much for your attention on this module, and until the next time, goodbye and God bless.